Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you everyone for being here for this program and coming to learn more about what I find to be one of the most fascinating aspects of history of the Holocaust that is also almost completely unexamined. So I'm excited that you're here to learn about this topic. As Paul suggested, we will leave time at the end for questions, and so please feel free to ask any questions. I'm going to cover a bunch of different aspects of this period of time, but I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'll just mention, I don't know, Paul, there was a chapter that I had suggested about Jewish life in the aftermath, about Jewish displaced persons, that comes from this volume called Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust that Paul mentioned, which well, I guess I am going to plug it briefly, which is just to say that for teachers who are looking to teach about the history of the Holocaust, I think it's got 20 amazing chapters that are very brief, about 5,000 or 6,000 words about different aspects about how to teach the history of the Holocaust using specific types of sources. So it's really, really user-friendly and very much designed with an eye to suggestions for teachers about how to teach these difficult topics to your students. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. 1 second. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. Without further ado, we'll dive right in. So what I suggested I wanted to focus my remarks on today is what I find to be one of the most fascinating and remarkable periods in 20th century history, and for that matter, modern Jewish history, but one which also tends to be frequently overlooked. And that is the 3-year period between the end of the Holocaust in 1945 and the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. A 3-year period of time which witnessed a remarkable rebirth of Jewish life in the displaced persons camps of Germany, Austria, and Italy, improbably and unpredictably in the immediate aftermath of liberation. And the picture that you can see here is a picture from a place which I'm going to tell you more about in a little bit. It's a agricultural training farm called Kibbutz Nili. And these are young survivors less than a year after the end of the war on this kibbutz or training farm in Germany. And I will tell you more about the story of that place in a little bit. But let me start here. On April 29th, 1945, the US Army liberated Dachau, where the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions and the 20th Armored Division of the US Army liberated approximately 32,000 prisoners at Dachau. On April 27th, 1945, US soldier Aaron A. Eiferman of the 12th Armored Division wrote a letter to his wife describing conditions in Kaufering 4, one of the sub-camps of Dachau, a Nazi concentration camp in the area of Landsberg. As Allied troops moved across Europe in a series of offensives against Nazi Germany, they began to encounter tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners. Through the spring of 1945, American and Allied forces liberated numerous concentration camps as they closed in on Berlin. The battle-hardened Allied soldiers were shocked at what they had discovered. As Eiferman wrote in the letter home to his wife, "We have seen what can be called the living dead." And he described the horrific scenes that they observed as they liberated these concentration camps. You can see here, this is an image from Buchenwald upon liberation. Just 2 weeks earlier, US soldiers had liberated Buchenwald. The concentration camp built by the Nazis in 1937 was one of the largest concentration camps, and it probably stirs all sorts of images and associations for us. After Kristallnacht in November of 1938, the November pogrom, almost 10,000 Jews were sent there. And during the war, it became a major center of forced labor with over 100,000 prisoners in the sub-camp system by February of 1945. Upon seeing Buchenwald liberated on April 11th, 1945, a member of the 333rd Engineers Regiment stated, quote, "My feeling was that this was the most shattering experience of my life." A US Army chaplain trying to make sense of the carnage wrote to his wife, quote, "This was a hell on earth if there ever was one." And after photographing Buchenwald, Margaret Bork White wrote to her editor at Life magazine, quote, The sights that I have just seen are so unbelievable that I don't think I will believe them myself until I've seen the photographs. One American journalist wrote, Buchenwald is beyond all comprehension. You just can't understand it even when you've seen it. But here I'm showing you a different side of Buchenwald that you've probably never heard of. And this is a place called Kibbutz Buchenwald. That's what's written on the side of this building, where we see survivors not long after liberation pictured. In the case of the aptly named Kibbutz Buchenwald, just a few days before they opened their farm, the young survivors of Buchenwald approached a young Jewish army chaplain by the name of Herschel Schachter, asking for his assistance to create their farm. With the assistance of Chaplain Schachter and an American colonel, these young members of this agricultural training farm secured a former Nazi estate near Eggendorf, making their kibbutz the first agricultural training farm to be formed in the displaced persons camps in the US zone of Germany. This was on June 3rd, 1945, so less than 2 months after liberation of the Buchenwald concentration camp. Eventually, this model would become such an appealing option for thousands of young people in post-war Germany that 40 such farms would be opened on the estates of former Nazis and German farmers, thanks in no small part to the assistance of Jewish soldiers and chaplains who worked together with survivors after the war. The young survivors who formed Kibbutz Buchenwald kept a diary of their experiences in the first weeks after liberation. And what they wrote captured the chaos and disorientation of those first few weeks in the aftermath of liberation. As they wrote in their diary, quote, the Jews suddenly faced themselves. Where now? Where to? They saw that they were different from all the other inmates of the concentration camp. For them, things were not so simple. To go back to Poland, to Hungary, to streets empty of Jews, towns empty of Jews, a world without Jews, to wander in those lands, lonely, homeless, always with the tragedy before one's eyes, and to meet again a former Gentile neighbor who would open his eyes wide and smile, remarking with double meaning, quote, what, Yanko, you're still alive? Yes, the Jews faced themselves. Was our tragedy only beginning? This was an excerpt from their diary at Kibbutz Buchenwald. As a number of Jewish survivors of Buchenwald wrote soon after liberation, in the wake of tremendous destruction, the future was uncertain. And yet, despite this disorder and confusion, the surviving Jewish population quickly organized itself, asserting its presence, vitality, and resilience. And here you can see, so just to give you a sense of the context, this is a map of some of these places that I've been talking about as the Allied forces closed in on Germany at the end of the war. The US liberating camps here in the southern part of Germany. We can see places I've mentioned, Dachau and Landsberg, and here's Buchenwald, if you can see my cursor. British forces liberating sites in the north, like Bergen-Belsen, which would become the largest Jewish displaced persons camp in the British zone. And then the Red Army advancing from the east, the Soviets. In fact, the reason that we observe International Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27th is, as you can see here, Auschwitz liberated on January 27th, 1945. And here I'll come back to this image in a few moments, but this is a young Jewish chaplain by the name of Rabbi Abraham Klausner standing with recently liberated prisoners of Dachau. I think this picture is in Landsberg, or it might be in Munich after the war. And this is the chaplain that I mentioned before, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, who helped the newly liberated prisoners from Buchenwald to create that farm that I mentioned, Kibbutz Buchenwald. So here he is leading services for Buchenwald survivors not long after liberation. So all of this organizing that was taking place had to be done in an enormously chaotic situation that existed in post-war Germany. These displaced persons that I'm referring to, this was a category that had been created by the Allies in the aftermath of the war. A displaced person defined as a civilian outside the national boundaries of their country by reason of war who are desirous desirous but unable to return home or find homes without assistance, or to be returned to enemy or ex-enemy territory. And in the first days and weeks following the liberation of Germany by the Allied forces, the country was inundated with the liberated captives of the Nazi regime who sought to make sense of this new situation for which they had long hoped. With the conclusion of the war on May 8th, there were up to 10 million forced laborers, prisoners of war, and other displaced persons who flooded the roads of Germany in their desire to return home. After liberation, and I think I have a map here where you can see this. Okay, oops, did I skip that map? There it is. So after liberation, Germany was divided into 4 zones, which you can see here on this map. I'll explain in a moment why most of the Jewish displaced persons camps were in the American zone of liberation, which you can see here. This purple zone was a French zone. The green zone was the British zone. And this pink salmon colored zone was the Soviet zone of occupation. So this was the 4 zones of Germany, and similarly Austria we can also see divided into zones of occupation. And here's Italy, and all of these sites will become significant. So Germany was divided into these 4 zones of occupation. The majority of the Jewish population, perhaps 35,000 out of some 50,000 who had been liberated from concentration camps in Germany, were in the American zone of occupation, most of them concentrated in the region around Munich, which we can see here. While millions of displaced persons were successfully returned to their home countries by the US Army, there were close to 1.5 million refugees who avoided repatriation, many of them for fear of being branded collaborators upon their return home. According to statistics that have been prepared by UNRWA, or the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, there were approximately 1.5 million DPs in Germany, Austria, and Italy, of which they calculated about 53,000 were Jews, about 3.6%. And so in addition to that, there were 900,000 Poles, 140,000 Balts from Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, 121,000 Hungarians, and a variety of other European nationalities as well. Singled out for extermination by the Nazis, Jews were the least likely to have survived the war, and thus constituted a very small minority of the total number of refugees in Germany upon liberation. Immediately following liberation, while most of the 10 million displaced persons, POWs, and forced laborers made the decision to return home with ease, as noted in the diary of Kibbutz Buchenwald, the 50,000 or so Jewish displaced persons did not face such a clear decision. Unsure of what awaited them at home, often fairly certain that their families had been destroyed during the war, those who decided to stay in a DP camp also had to face the fact that this meant continuing to live with collaborators who had also refused to return home. So in this initial period, with the categorization of displaced persons according to national origin from enemy and allied countries, those Jews who did survive were frequently placed with former collaborators from their countries of origin. So again, the Allies organized people according to place of national origin and did not recognize the Jewish displaced persons as a separate category. And this was in keeping with the definition that I read before of how they were defining displaced persons as civilians who were outside of the national boundaries of their country. Jewish DPs who made the choice to stay in Germany then faced a choice. They could remain in a displaced persons camp, a DP camp, which was usually German military barracks or former POW camps or slave labor camps. Sometimes these were hastily erected tent cities. Sometimes this was industrial housing that was taken over from factories in the region, or they didn't want to leave in essentially what was a refugee camp. They could leave a displaced persons camp, but this meant that they were making the choice to settle in a German city, which also, as we might imagine, would have been a very difficult and unlikely decision to make, although there were about 15,000 German Jewish survivors who did try to rebuild the community in German cities. Here's Klausner, who I mentioned before, in conducting a survey of conditions faced by Jewish displaced persons in Germany immediately after liberation. Chaplain Abraham Klausner, the second chaplain to reach Dachau, a rabbi by the name of Eli Bonin was the first. Klausner toured around the DP camps in the American zone of Germany, and he visited approximately 14,000 Jews who were living in 17 DP camps 1 month following liberation. He found deplorable conditions, poor accommodations, no plumbing, no clothing, rampant disease, continuing malnourishment, and a lack of any plan on the part of the American military. Quote, liberated but not free. That is the paradox of the Jew, Klausner concluded in a report to his supervisor, Philip Bernstein, detailing the condition of the Jewish survivors. Klausner, who died in 2007, had arrived at Dachau shortly after liberation and was assigned to handle death certificates and burials. But he soon became the point man for Jewish refugees struggling with hardship and despair, this time under the American military occupation. One thing that Klausner began to do is he quickly began making lists of survivors in order to reunite families, and he urged soldiers to provide food for the Jews. He also commandeered hospitals for the use of Jewish refugees and employed the military mail service in defiance of US Army regulations to help Jews find their families. In a testimony taken many years after the war, Klausner recalled developing a tracing service for the survivors, many of whom had walked or traveled by various means to reach the American zone of Germany. And here I'm going to read an excerpt from his oral history testimony. He says, people came out of Eastern Europe into Munich, and we set up a large tracing program. Besides the books, which you can see here, the volume called Sherita Pleta, the surviving remnant that we published, Klausner says we had a center in Munich at the Deutsches Museum, first where people came from all over Europe and came asking about their family. And as he described, people would come and tear the pages out of the book. And so then we would have to feed the table with books, and then we would nail the pages down so that they would last a little bit longer. But if a person came and found no name in the book, they would go over to the wall. It was a very large wall, and they'd write a note on the wall, for example, saying, quote, I was here, addressing it to a parent or to a child, or quote, I've been looking for you and I'll be here or going there. And so they, at some point, they hoped that they would be able to connect. Now, what Klausner is describing, and I think is an important thing to point out to our students, is how difficult it would have been to communicate with anyone in the aftermath of the war and to find out whether or not they had survived. And so even this effort to create lists of names identifying who had survived and where they were was an incredibly important project. The title I'll just mentioned, so the title that Klausner came up with for this surviving remnants, you can see it's called Sherita Pleta. It comes from biblical origin, specifically the writings of the prophets, who predicted that in the aftermath of the destruction, you can see it from the prophet Micah, I will turn the lame into a remnant and the expelled into a populous nation, and the Lord will reign over them on Mount Zion now and forevermore, right? So he evoked the writings of the prophets to say that in the aftermath of destruction, there would be a surviving remnant, a Sherita Pleta, and that was what he, how he described his names project. And in this way, Klausner and other chaplains and soldiers involved with this effort tried to help families and sometimes orphan children reconnect. As Klausner also described, however, he and other chaplains confronted a post-war American military occupation force that was largely unequipped to deal with such a large population of refugees. You can see a picture of two brothers reunited at a DP hospital at St. Titilian, which was actually a monastery run by monks not far from Landsberg, that he commandeered for use by Jewish soldiers. As Klausner described, though, the American military had been trained to fight and defeat Germany, something they did very successfully, but they were not a force that was meant to care for refugees. And so while organizing amongst themselves, the displaced persons and chaplains like Klausner continued to describe the poor conditions. And Klausner, in a lot of his early work, worked very closely with survivors themselves, who also realized from an early period of time that they were going to have to advocate for themselves, that no one was coming to rescue them or to help them. Eventually, Klausner, working together with survivors who began to advocate for themselves, began to organize a political apparatus, began to organize letter writing campaigns, began to describe the poor conditions that were taking place. And so finally, as they were describing the horrible conditions that they were confronting, in response, President Truman, this was after FDR had died in April of 1945, President Truman dispatched Earl Harrison to the DP camps in the summer of 1945, in July and August of 1945, to assess the situation that the surviving population was confronting. Klausner's efforts fighting the American military's indifference to the plight of newly liberated survivors culminated when he eventually accompanied Earl Harrison on an eye-opening tour of the displaced persons camps. And here you can see this was the report that Harrison published in September of 1945 on the plight of the displaced Jews in Europe. We can see here a picture. This is Earl Harrison visiting the Bergen-Belsen DP camp in the British zone in July of 1945. And in his scathing report back to Truman, Harrison stated that, quote, "As matters now stand, we," meaning the Americans, "appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops." And so, very importantly, Harrison proposed that Jews be separated into their own camps. Until then, they had been forced to live, as we've discussed, with other national groups and former collaborators. And he recommended that the ideal way to solve their stateless condition would be to provide them with 100,000 immigration certificates to Palestine, which he suggested should be granted immediately to solve the problem of their statelessness and send them to Palestine, where the Zionist movement was working to build a Jewish state. Now, as we'll learn, this would be rejected by the British and would create a very complicated situation. Under the guidance of President Truman and General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Americans responded swiftly to Harrison's recommendations to recognize the Jews as a distinct nationality who would be housed in exclusively Jewish camps and to aid their eventual immigration from Germany. In late 1945, operation of the displaced persons camps was administered entirely by UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and other voluntary agencies, most notably the Joint Distribution Committee, which played a key role in providing and supplementing the rations and other vital components of everyday life that were needed by the surviving population. Harrison also recommended appointing an advisor for Jewish affairs, which also would play a key role in helping advocate on behalf of the surviving population to the US military authorities. Rabbi Judah Nadich was the first advisor, and he became General Eisenhower's advisor for Jewish affairs, working to improve the conditions of the Jewish survivors, while also becoming an unofficial spokesperson to Jewish newspapers reporting on conditions that were faced by survivors in post-war Germany. But truthfully, one of the most important things that happened in the creation of separate Jewish DP camps was that survivors began to have an opportunity to advocate for themselves and to help themselves and to govern themselves and to demonstrate a great deal of autonomy and resilience and agency, taking care of their own needs. And so as Jews were allowed to create separate Jewish displaced persons camps, they quickly developed a fiercely independent political framework that was ardently Zionist in nature and actively and vociferously spoke out on behalf of the surviving population. There was a representative organization called the Central Committee of Liberated Jews that was formed, which advocated on behalf of the political needs of the surviving population, both to the US military authorities and as we'll see, to other international bodies that would visit the DP camps and try to understand how their stateless condition could be resolved. Early in 1946, the Allied armies and the relief agencies like UNRWA officially and formally recognized the Central Committee of Liberated Jews, which was democratic in nature and had a democratically elected representative body. So you can see here Shmuel Gringaus, who was one of its first official representatives, a doctor from Kovno in Lithuania by the name of Zalman Grinberg, was another very early leader of the surviving population. Grinberg was actually among the first to actually take over that DP hospital at St. Ottilian. And there's an interesting component to the surviving population that we see a lot of medical doctors playing it who had managed to survive, playing an important role in being the early leadership of the surviving population. And as I've mentioned, additionally, in the British zone, we see similarly Jewish surviving Jews like Joseph Rosenzapf advocating and representing on behalf of the surviving population vis-a-vis the British authorities as well. We can see here, so you can see sort of the three representative agencies: UNRWA from the United Nations, the US Army, and this is Leo Schwartz, who was in charge of the Joint Distribution Committee, discussing the situation in post-war Germany. And one of the things that begins to happen is that as the Americans continue to allow surviving Jews to travel from Eastern Europe and infiltrate the American zone of Germany, the surviving population continues to grow as more and more Jews who have survived the war in Poland and in the far reaches of the Soviet Union who have been repatriated to Poland begin to make their way to the Jewish displaced persons camps in post-war Germany. On the diplomatic level, the assistance rendered by Jewish GIs and chaplains helped play a really important role in the surviving population beginning to advocate for itself and to facilitate what would be a flourishing Zionist framework in the displaced persons camps. And this ardent Zionist enthusiasm, which I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A, in many ways was a conclusion that the surviving population reached in the aftermath of the war. In fact, in many cases during the war itself, that there was no future for them in Europe, and that sort of an obvious conclusion to the destruction of European Jewry during the war was that they had to support the creation of a Jewish national home, a place where Jews could protect and defend themselves. These Zionist training farms that I described before, like a kibbutz Buchenwald or kibbutz Nili, were emblematic of survivors' desires to prepare for their future lives in Palestine. And here again, the needs of the survivors, the Zionist movement, and Jewish GIs and chaplains who helped support them came together in a beneficial way. And so you can see here in this picture, this is a picture of David Ben-Gurion, who at the time was the head of the Jewish Agency executive in Palestine. This was essentially the state in the making, the representative body of the Zionist movement in Palestine. He came to visit the displaced persons camps in post-war Germany, and he was pleasantly surprised. He did not necessarily expect to find a ardently Zionist population. And when he came to tour the DP camps, he realized very quickly that with this sort of organic Zionism expressed by the surviving population, that he could use that in a diplomatic sense. You can see here in this picture, he's visiting the Landsberg DP camp, which was one of the largest DP camps, greeted by Major Irving Haymont from the US military, who was in charge of that DP camp. And here's Abe Klausner, who always had a way of finding his way into these pictures as well. And one thing that became clear is Ben-Gurion met with General Eisenhower and met with General Walter Bedell Smith, who was in charge of the US zone. He learned that US authorities did not intend to stop Jewish infiltrates from Eastern Europe who were traveling with an organization called the Bricha, literally this means the movement of escape. It was a semi-organized movement of Jewish flight from Poland, that the US authorities were not stopping refugees who were traveling from the east into the American zone. And so Ben-Gurion realized that there was an opportunity here to try to bring as many Jewish survivors as possible into the occupation zones that were under US command. In the wake of the Harrison Report, which had excoriated American authorities for poor treatment of Jews, American officials were eager to provide separate camps for Jews and were determined to improve conditions for the Jewish population. And so Ben-Gurion, when he visited in the fall of 1945, also offered a number of suggestions for how to improve morale of the surviving population, and advocated for Jews to be allowed to govern themselves and for support to be given for these agricultural training farms that I have described. So here's that picture which I showed you before, which is one of these farms, this kibbutz called Nili, which was a kibbutz of the United Zionist movement called Noham. And it was populated by young survivors in the aftermath of the war. You can see here, if you look at these pictures, this is not what we normally imagine Holocaust survivors to look like. But again, this is a picture taken of survivors not long after liberation. It's probably about less than a year after liberation. And they're on this farm, which they had named Nili, which comes from an acronym, Netzach Yisrael Lo Yishaker, the eternal strength of Israel shall not be belied. And they were working on this farm, preparing for their future lives in what they hoped would be the land of Israel. This was not just any agricultural training farm. Here you can see a picture of them from the first Passover Seder in April of 1946, where they are marking the Jewish liberation from slavery in Egypt. But of course, they're evoking sort of the contemporary liberation from slavery. In fact, it even says here, from slavery to redemption on the wall, Mishiabut Legeula. And this farm that they're on, where they have cows that they've given Hebrew names, and they're learning Hebrew, and they're making productive use of their time, preparing for their future lives, was not just any farm. This was a farm that was actually the farm of this man, Julius Streicher. And Julius Streicher, for those of you who know, was one of the foremost Nazi anti-Semites, publisher of Der Stürmer, one of the foremost anti-Semitic Nazi papers. And as Streicher was on trial at the Nuremberg trials for essentially for incitement to genocide, these young people were using his farm and in effect kind of engaging in this form of, let's call it, symbolic revenge. So you can think about how that would be a very appealing model in the aftermath of the war. But the truth is that we have a number of these, 40 of these farms with thousands of people, young people living on them. And it's this fascinating period of time where we see this very sort of independent, vocal, very young surviving population. You can see here, it makes sense if we think about it, that would be a very young population, mainly because that was who was most likely to survive the war. Young people who would have been selected for labor. And you can see here the demographics of the surviving population, always disproportionately between the ages of, so this is broken down between 6 to 17 and 18 to 44. This was statistics collected by the Joint Distribution Committee. So 85% in this age range, really between 17 and 35. You have at least 80% in that range between 17 to 35. But you'll also notice something else if you look at this demographic data, which shows us that by January of 1947, and this is the number, this is representative of the number of people surveyed. So by January of 1947, in the American zone of Germany, they're surveying 140,000 Jews. The estimate is that by the spring of 1947, there are 250,000 Jews who have entered the displaced persons camps in Germany, the American zones of Germany and Austria, and also in Italy as well, right? So the population is growing as more and more Jews are coming from Eastern Europe to Central Europe. But you can also see something else happening demographically, which is that while there have been no babies in the early period of time surveyed, we do see a growing number of babies being born at this period of time. I'm going to skip this for now, but this just shows us sort of where people are coming from. Again, the majority of the population is coming from Poland, but there are also survivors from Hungary, Romania, Germany, other lands, and the Soviet Union as well. But the other thing that we see happening in this period of time is a lot of people start getting married. Many people who have lost their families and are eager to start new families. So it's both finding families and starting new families. And there's an astounding number of weddings that take place in the displaced persons camps. This is a wedding invitation from the British zone, from Bergen-Belsen. You also see, this is a wedding contract at Katuba from Bergen-Belsen, but you also see what's been described as the DP baby boom happening at this period of time. And in 1946 to 1947, according to some estimates, the surviving population of the Shireta. If somebody can mute, I hear just make sure everybody's muted.
Don't wait for them to let you, just go.
I don't know, Paul, if you can figure out who's unmuted. So among the surviving population, as has been one survivor noted, quote, the first year it was all lonely single people, but by the second year it was everyone with a carriage. And my colleague Atina Grossman, who teaches at Cooper Union, she's written about this, and she describes this this baby boom as a type of what she calls biological revenge, right? This statement by the surviving Jews that you could not destroy us, wir seien da, right? We are here, right? And that the Jewish people would not be destroyed and would continue. And after years of trauma and loneliness, not only do we see sort of people rebuilding families, but the DP camps turn into active cultural and social centers. And so despite the often bleak conditions in the DP camps, we see, baby nurseries being opened, and there's a great deal of focus on the babies that are born. We see social and occupational organizations abound. Journalism springs to life in the DP camps. There are more than 170 different publications that are published in the displaced persons camps. Books are published. This is from one of the DP camps called Neu Freimann. This was a journal called Bamidbar, which for those of you who know Hebrew, is a biblical reference as well. It refers to in the wilderness or in the desert. And there was this sense on the part of the surviving population that, like the biblical Israelites who had been liberated from slavery in Egypt, they were now in the wilderness on their journey to the promised land. But post-war Germany, where they were essentially stuck waiting for resolution to their stateless condition, was like the wilderness. So we do see a lot of references, biblical references to that idea in the aftermath of liberation. Some of the earliest forms of writing and remembering about the Holocaust we see taking place in the DP camps. This is from another newspaper of a Zionist youth movement, the Young Guard, Hashomer Hatzair. This is a commemoration of the 3rd anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising from April 19th, but this is April of 1946. Here's a lecture from the 5th anniversary about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Sports is, people need to find a way to spend their time. And so we see a lot of sporting competitions taking place in the DP camps. That was a boxing competition. Some of the earliest documentation of the history of the Holocaust we have taking place by central historical commissions, which are created in the DP camps. You can see here, this is a poster calling on the surviving population to remember what Amalek has done unto you, the sort of biblical evil of Amalek. Collect and record, write down your testimony before it's too late. Do it for those who have died. Do it in a way that evokes the notion that in every other catastrophe in Jewish history, the enslavement in Egypt, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the expulsion from Spain. This is a reference to the Khmelnytsky pogroms in the 1600s. Every time Jews have written it down and written about it, this is how we know what happened. We, in the aftermath of this destruction, also have an obligation to collect and to record. Sammelt und Feldzeichen, to collect and record, write it down. And this is a historical commission publishes a journal called Von Letzten Chorben, which you can see here, where they share some of these testimonies. Holiday celebrations are also an opportunity for people both to celebrate the fact that they're alive, but also to remember. This is the first Purim celebrated in the Landsberg DP camp. And here they are celebrating the defeat of the modern day Haman on the holiday of Purim. Of course, here's a young survivor dressing up as Adolf Hitler and sort of reenacting the holiday of Purim. Same thing on Passover, great deal. This is a survivor's Haggadah, which evokes the most recent enslavement of the Jewish people. There's an active theatrical life which is taking place in the DP camps, schools which are being opened, yeshivas which are testifying to the rebuilding of religious life. The texture of Jewish life in the DP camps was so rich that the Central Committee leader, Shmuel Gringaus, who we refer to, stated, quote, "Let us be the ones to show the world that the bright light of the Jews will never be extinguished." And as I've mentioned, as time went on from 45 into 46 and into 47, the Zionist movement, the Bricha, continued to facilitate the migration of Jews who were looking to escape from Eastern Europe, where pogroms in many places continued in the aftermath of the war. In July of 1946, there was a large pogrom in Kielce in Poland, and this convinced a lot of Jews who might have remained in Poland that they should leave. And so there was a stream of refugees leaving with the Bricha, so that by the spring of 1947, we have this number of 250,000 surviving Jews in Germany, Italy, and Austria. And while I can't go into detail on all of the diplomatic discussions that led the United Nations to eventually support the partition of Palestine, it's clear that American support for the creation of a Jewish state as a solution to the Jewish refugee problem was crucial. Jewish GIs, chaplains, JDC workers, and others were vital in helping to facilitate a flourishing framework, network of farms, summer camps, and Zionist youth movements. And as I mentioned before, after the Harrison report, in which Earl Harrison said, it's very simple, let's give 100,000 certificates to allow the surviving population to immigrate to Palestine, the British were not so happy with this suggestion because they, first of all, had in effect their white paper, which continued to maintain a blockade of Palestine and was trying to limit Jewish migration to Palestine because of the very real problem they were dealing with there, which was increasing tensions between the Jewish population and the Arab population, the Palestinian nationalist movement and the Zionist movement. And there was increasing conflict between these movements. And the British knew that increasing migration of Jews, even surviving Jews, to Palestine would only foment tensions even more. At the same time, they could not very well reject American suggestions, especially in the aftermath of the war. So after the Harrison report, the British proposed a commission, which becomes known as the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, which goes around and surveys the situation of the surviving population to see how they can solve their problem of statelessness after the war for the refugees. And so they go around and they interview the surviving population and they ask them, where would you like to go? And something like 95% of the surviving Jews say that they would like to go to Palestine. You can see here a demonstration of young survivors. Wir willen zurück in unser Heim Eretz Yisrael. They write in Yiddish, we want to go back to our home in the land of Israel. And so on the diplomatic level, the high visibility of the Zionist enthusiasm expressed by the surviving population, the kibbutzim that we've talked about, it convinced outside observers that this was a population that was ardently passionate about immigrating to Palestine. And so the Anglo-American Committee, which was equally composed of British and American representatives, seconded Harrison's recommendations and said, yes, we should give 100,000 certificates to the surviving population to reach Palestine. Over the course of 1946, though, these deliberations dragged on, tensions increased in Palestine, and by February of 1947, the British referred the problem of Palestine to the United Nations, and eventually this support played a key role in connecting the displaced persons' plight to the situation in Palestine, leading to the United Nations resolution in November of 1947, supporting the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state in November of 1947. And ultimately, so this is from the Third Congress of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in April of 1948, it became clear that war was going to break out in Palestine as soon as the British left. And in fact, in the spring of 1948, what becomes Israel Defense Forces, the Haganah, begins a conscription campaign, and about 8,000 survivors are drafted into the Haganah, what becomes the Israel Defense Force, and end up joining in the fighting in Palestine, or after the state of Israel is declared in May of 1948 after the invasion, and the war breaks out. So we have this tragic irony of it takes one war for many of the survivors to end up having a place to immigrate to in the aftermath of another war. So just to wrap up, I think we can see here that the vibrancy of the Jewish displaced persons population shows us nonetheless that in a remarkably short period of time after the war, not only on the political, social, and cultural level did survivors return to life, but on a religious and spiritual plane as well. And this rebirth experienced by the DPs allowed them not only to come back to life as human beings, but allowed them to come back to life as Jews as well. Thank you so much. I hope we have about 20, 25 minutes for questions. I'm more than happy to take any questions. I know I covered a lot of ground, so please feel free to type things into the chat and I'll happily answer your questions.
Thank you, Professor Patt, for it's a great presentation and really covered, I think, many of the key points of the topic, which is a fantastic topic. While people are thinking of their questions, I wrote something down, and you probably said it in the beginning, and I just didn't catch it, so I apologize. But why was it that the American zone tended? Why was that the place that refugees went, and why did the American zone have more DP camps than like say the British one? And I understand like the Russians had a different policy, so I understand that they just, I think, set people back, but I was just wondering if you could speak about that.
Yeah, no problem. And I'm going to share the map again just to show what I'm talking about. So as Paul, there's a number of factors that come into play here. So you can see that a lot of the concentration camps that the Americans liberate here in the southern zone and around Munich, what becomes the American zone, there's a lot of concentration camps where they find surviving Jewish population. And in fact, sorry, somebody's mic is off. In fact, in the area in and around Munich, which I mentioned a few times becomes sort of the center of the surviving population, you have these DP camps like Landsberg. Part of this has to do with the history of the war itself, Paul. So Sorry, I'm just waiting for the noise to go
Yeah,
away.
if whoever, sorry, 1 second. Hold on. Whoever is unmuted, can you, let's take a moment, if everybody could check to make sure that they're muted. Okay, you know what, I can actually, so Avi, hold on 1 second, I can mute everybody, and then then I'll unmute you. Hold on 1 second. All.
Okay. You can hear me. Yeah. That's better. So, sorry, just to answer your question, Paul, it is very, very important for us to understand that most of the surviving population find themselves in what becomes the American zone. My best explanation for why this happens has to do with the history of the war itself, which is that there are a lot of survivors who, at the end of the war, are brought back to concentration camps and on death marches. If you're familiar with this, as the war is coming to an end, the Nazis bring some of their slave labor population back into Germany on death marches. And so, for example, in this camp by Landsberg, which is a sub-camp of the Dachau system, a lot of the Jewish prisoners who have been brought into the Dachau sub-camp system at the end of the war, they're being forced to work on projects to help the German war effort. So, for example, Kaufering, which I mentioned before at the beginning, is a camp where they're manufacturing parts for the Luftwaffe. And so this helps explain like who is still alive at the end of the war, the fact that they've been brought back to work in these camps like Dachau or the sub-camps, and that they're most likely to remain alive at the end of the war. And I guess it's somewhat sort of a coincidence of the end of that this is the American zone, right? That this is the part. But as we've seen strategically, it becomes very important that the Americans are more willing and open to supporting sort of Jewish national aspirations, to allow the Jews to identify themselves, to have separate Jewish displaced persons camps, which allows them to create this sort of active network to advocate for themselves. In the Soviet zone, there are no DP camps that are created. There's a sense that nobody's displaced in the Soviet zone, right? Berlin is an exception because Berlin is divided into four occupation zones. And in the British zone, this is slightly more complicated. So there is this really large DP camp, Jewish DP camp in Bergen-Belsen, but the British are much more reluctant, mainly because of their problems with Zionism and the conflict in Palestine, much more reluctant to recognize sort of Jewish national aspirations and recognize the Jewish DPs as a separate national entity. But in Bergen-Belsen, you do have very active Zionist politics there that is very much anti-British at the same time.
Thank you very much. That's really, actually fascinating. And I didn't know that much about Bergen-Belsen. So, thank you for adding to that. In the meantime, we actually have a number of questions that have come in. So let me see if I can share those with you. Okay. So here's a question from one of the participants. She writes, I was born in Salzheim. How can I find out how my parents ended up there? And she writes, Salzheim was like the Waldorf Astoria of DP camps.
I like that description. So I actually, I'm trying to think if I have a copy of this here. I'm going to send it to you, Paul, and then maybe you can send it to Faye. I was involved in a project with the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, in which they actually collected a lot of material on Salzheim. And I'm going to send you a link to that, Paul, and then maybe you can share that with Faye. And it's got a lot of really interesting material, very specifically on that. And then Actually, I think in the We Are Here volume that you referenced before, the edited volume on the Jewish DPs in the aftermath of the war, there is also a chapter in there on Salzheim also specifically. So that's a few suggestions for places to find material on that.
If I could just add a little bit, the rabbi of my synagogue was in Salzheim also, and I think was operating a yeshiva there. But I believe that the U.S. HMM has a photograph collection of photographs from Salzheim. So
yeah, so one thing I just want to mention, like sort of generally, that's fascinating about this time period. There is so much material. It is a very, very well documented period of time, and so it's incredible what you can find. I mean, I mentioned like the very vibrant Jewish DP press. The surviving population is really active in writing about what they're going through there. So there's various newspapers that come from Salzheim, where if one can read Hebrew or Yiddish, then you can read quite a bit about what daily life was like. But other historians have written about these places. There's great photography collections, like you referenced, at USHMM and in other places. I think I came across at the Ghetto Fighters House. There's something called the Book of Life, which was created in Salzheim also, which was also just like an amazing kind of documentation project by survivors who were in Salzheim, who were just wanted to write about like the return to life in Salzheim. So there's a lot of material, for people who are interested in this to learn a lot more about this period of time.
thank you so much. Okay, we do have some more questions, and I'm glad we have a little bit more time, so that's great. Okay, what was the status of the DP camp in Cyprus? The British played a very questionable role geopolitically, having promised both the Arabs and the Jews the same lands. Okay, I guess the question really here, I guess they're asking about the Cyprus DP camp in light of the fact that the British seem to support both the sort of the Arab position and the Zionist position.
Yeah, so really, really good question about Cyprus, which I apologize, I didn't spend any time talking about, but I'm glad you asked about it now. So as a result of the blockade that the British had, and during the war, they had a blockade to prevent immigration to Palestine, and in the aftermath of the war, they had a blockade to prevent immigration to Palestine. So I showed some pictures of like these refugee boats at the very end, which attempted to break the blockade. Some of you might be familiar with the Paul Newman movie Exodus, which was a fictionalized version of a real story, which was about a ship called Exodus 1947. In the Paul Newman Hollywood version, they break through the blockade and they land in Palestine. In the true story, they're intercepted by the British and returned to Germany. And in fact, Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, the British decide that they're very tired of these Jews trying to, break their blockade on these ships, trying to land in Palestine, that instead of allowing people to disembark, which they had at first, and counting them against the quota of 15,000 a year who were allowed to land in Palestine, they would put them into camps. Essentially, the survivors described them. They're not exactly concentration camps, but they were internment camps behind barbed wire and with British troops guarding the gates there in Cyprus. And so by 1947, there are 50,000 refugees, Jewish DPs interned in Cyprus. It's hot, it's dusty, they're in these like tin sheds, so it's really hot in the summer and really cold in the winter, and they're there for a year. So it's actually an area that I just started looking at more seriously, just wrote an article about it, because I think from a psychological standpoint, you can think about, like, if you're somebody who's just been liberated from concentration camp or just gone through the war, and then to be re-interned in another type of internment camp, and we think about like post-traumatic stress disorder, what that might be like to be forced behind the barbed wire of another camp. I think it could be pretty traumatic. And there's been very, very, very little written about the experience of survivors on Cyprus. So I'm glad that that you asked about that.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is, and if you have these numbers, it's great. How many people went to the United States, to Canada, to Palestine, then Israel? Do you have any sense of what those numbers are like?
Yeah, really good question. So if we take it's a tricky question, and I'll tell you why it's tricky. It used to be that scholars would say about 2/3 went to Palestine/Israel, and I should say the vast majority of the DPs. So I broke down this period of time from 1945 to 1948. They managed to leave the DP camps after the state of Israel was created, and in many cases, sort of either in 1948 or after hostilities ended in 1949. So it used to be that we would say, okay, 2/3 go to Israel, and then the other 1/3 either come to the United States or to Canada, or I showed pictures at the end of Australia or Argentina. There's a few other, or South Africa, sort of a diaspora of Holocaust survivors. And I should mention, I didn't say this in my remarks, one of the important things for us to understand is that why are the Americans so supportive of sort of creation of Israel, a Jewish national solution? Well, the United States is not changing its immigration policy after the war. So the US, which had closed off migration in 1924 and was, if for those of you who watched the documentary, The US and the Holocaust, you learned a lot about, which was on PBS last year, about how restrictive US immigration policy was as refugees were trying to get out of Germany in the 30s and into the 40s. We, as a country, the United States, do not change our immigration policy in 45. We don't really change it until 1950. So most of the DPs, and this is a big what if, what if the United States had been open? How many survivors would have come here immediately? A lot of them probably would have chosen to. So this is like sort of a counterfactual. We don't know. And so I said 2/3, 1/3. However, the reason it gets trickier is that there are, and we don't know the exact numbers on this, but there are in the tens of thousands of survivors who go to Israel in 48, 49, 50, 51, and then leave once they have an opportunity to come to the United States. Because, from an economic standpoint, this is the land of opportunity. There are many more economic opportunities here. People might have surviving family members. Israel in the 1950s was in a horrible economic situation, right? It was a period of austerity. It was really a poor place. It had absorbed hundreds of thousands of immigrants, both Holocaust survivors and Jews from the Middle East who had been expelled from their homes, right? So we can understand why it was not the most ideal place from an economic standpoint to try to rebuild your life. So that's where, of the 2/3, it's probably more like 60% ends up, and then another 40% either go to other places or leave in the early years after the creation of the state.
Thank you. Have a few more questions, so we'll do as many as we can. Also, are there lists of survivors who, this person's asking about the Bergen-Belsen DP camp, but you could probably ask, the same about some of the other camps.
Yeah, so I was just, there's a memorial at Bergen-Belsen, the Gedenkstätte in Bergen-Belsen, and I think they have really good data on who was in the camp, and so it's definitely worth contacting the Bergen-Belsen Memorial Organization. I see that somebody else mentions the Bad Arolsen archive. So the International Tracing Service, ITS, which is based in Bad Arolsen, that's why it's called the Arolsen Archive. That's also a great resource to try to track where people were both during the war and in the aftermath of the war, because if people were looking for surviving family members, or wanted to register as someone who was persecuted by the Nazis, they would go through this process. Or we find material there. So for example, for visa purposes, you would be interviewed by somebody from the United States or the consulate, and you would register and record all of your information, and then also record in many cases where you were during the war. So you can find these questionnaires at Bad Arolsen, at the International Tracing Service, and these questionnaires give us a lot of information for where people were during and after the war. And what stands out about looking at those questionnaires is this was also a highly mobile population. And so people might move around quite a bit in the aftermath of the war, either looking for surviving family members, or you get married and you move with your partner somewhere else, or you're, hoping to immigrate somewhere else. So people are on the move, as survivors would describe us, living on packed suitcases, right? Because you were in a refugee camp, you were looking to put down roots, in the DP camp you were. So in that sense, it's hard to track people, and you see them move around quite a bit. At the same time, so for example, the Joint Distribution Committee, which was responsible for delivering the rations to the camps, they worked closely together with the Central Committee of Liberated Jews, and then the different camp committees that were administered by the Jews in different DP camps. They would try to count how many Jews were in their displaced persons camp, so that they knew how much food to give them, and how many books to give them, and how much clothing to give them, and etc. And so sometimes in those records, so for example, at the Center for Jewish History, YIVO has a large collection from the displaced persons camps. The Joint Distribution Committee has collections from DP camps. You will find names lists as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm just taking a look at some. Or only have a few minutes left. So a number of these things. Okay, so I'll just go through what I have. One person asked whether there was military training in the DP camps, and whether the Americans sent Jews to Cyprus. So I think you may have answered the second one already, but if you don't mind just briefly addressing it.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question about military training in the DP camps. The Haganah, which was the sort of the movement for Jewish self-defense in Palestine, which becomes the predecessor organization to the Israel Defense Force, in particular in 1947, but already beginning in 1946, a lot of different movements are sending emissaries, representatives to the displaced persons camps. Different Zionist movements are sending representatives there, like the youth movements, which I talked a lot about, organizing young people. But the Haganah also starts sending representatives, and there are self-defense training courses that begin to be organized for young survivors in 1947. And in some cases, this is specifically connected to that enlistment campaign that begins in 1948, where people are drafted. 8,000, that's actually a rather significant number of survivors who are drafted to join the fighting in Israel after the state is created. There's probably about 20,000 total volunteers from abroad, 8,000 survivors who are conscripted. The IDF maybe has about 100,000 soldiers in the war in 1948, and about 60,000 of them are frontline fighters. So the 8,000 survivors is a pretty significant number if we think about how many survivors end up being drafted to fight in the war in 1948.
Yeah, thank you. Let me, if we're out of time, but there's just one last question I would like to ask, and if it's okay with everybody, which is, was actually asked by one of the teachers here. So you mentioned Bergen-Belsen, but there were other DP camps in the British zone too. Because this teacher mentions there was a DP camp, I guess, in Neustadt Holstein. And I'm not sure if she mentioned something else here as well. So I don't know, can you just maybe comment on that? Were there other DP camps in the
There
British
were
zone?
there were some smaller places in the British zone. Bergen-Belsen is by far the largest, and it's like the center. But there were a number of smaller places, and there's a book for people who are interested in the British zone. There's a book by Hagit Lavsky, Lavsky, who has written a history of the British zone, which most of us end up writing on about the American zone because there's a lot going on there and sort of interesting connections. But the British zone is also interesting, and so there's it's worth looking at. And I'll just mention that looking at the other questions, somebody mentioned. I skipped over, I mentioned very briefly vocational training. And so Sheila mentions ORT, and that is a major point of focus in the DP camps. The idea of, if you're going to be an immigrant to a new country, it's really important to give people vocational training so they can have specific, they'd be ready for specific jobs. And so there's a lot of time and energy invested in creating workshops and turning people into machinists or tailors or woodworking or carpentry or different things. And ORT is very much involved in this type of vocational training to help people to be ready for their new jobs in their new homelands.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to thank, on behalf of everybody here, Professor Patt, for a fantastic presentation, really rich and interesting, and we see what a incredible topic it is. And I am always inspired by how these people who went through really the worst were able to bring, many of them anyway, bring their lives together and rebuild their lives in so many ways. And I've said often to people I work with, the students I work with, that in Palestine, which became Israel, or in America, that these people brought a real shot in the arm, that they really reinvigorated the communities that they came to. So it's an amazing group of people. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today. I just wanted to say to everybody who's here, I'll be sending out an evaluation form either today or tomorrow. So please fill it out and return it. If you're interested in CTLE credit, you'll need to fill it out as well so that we know and can give you the appropriate credit. Our next program will be, I believe, on February 5th, the next Sunday, which is with John Barrett, and he'll be talking about the Nuremberg trials. And I'd like to again thank Professor Patt and everybody else for joining us. I want to wish everybody a great afternoon.
Thank you.